It's like we all search for that place where we belong, right?
Yeah.
That group, that community, that really gets us. But what happens when the very things that bring people together make it tough for others to find their footing? That's the kind of tricky thing we're digging into today.
Yeah.
Autism and organized religion, specifically with Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah. Fascinating topic.
Is a great request from one of our listeners,
Yeah.
and I think it's going to be a really interesting deep dive.
Absolutely. A lot of times we don't think about how different the experience of religion can be for someone on the autism spectrum, you know? And you guys picked a really interesting group to look at because Jehovah's Witnesses, they do things a bit differently, and that really highlights some of these challenges.
Right. Okay, so for anyone tuning in who might not be totally familiar, could you give us a quick rundown of what makes Jehovah's Witnesses unique? Like, what are some of their main beliefs and practices?
Well, most people know them for their door-to-door preaching, going right out to their communities to share their understanding of the Bible. They also have like really strict interpretations of the scriptures, which, that affects everything, their views on holidays, how they interact with the rest of the world, you name it.
Right, and I think it's important to remember, too, that when we talk about neurodiversity, a term we'll be using a lot today, we're simply acknowledging that brains work in all sorts of amazing ways.
Yeah.
Right? It's about differences, not deficits.
Exactly. And those differences, sometimes they can be tough to navigate, especially in environments with a lot of structure, especially when it comes to like how people socialize and communicate.
So true. Okay, so let's get into some of the specific challenges then. We've got the door-to-door evangelism, the strict routines, and the whole social aspect of being part of a really tight-knit religious group. Where do we even start unpacking how those things might feel different for someone on the spectrum?
Well, let's take evangelism, for example. Imagine you're autistic and you feel this pressure to approach strangers, strike up a conversation, and stick to a script. Now, for some people, that structure's comforting, but a lot of autistic individuals find unscripted social interaction really, really draining. It can be a recipe for anxiety. You know what I mean?
And it's not even just about going up to someone, is it? It's the expectation of, like, reading between the lines, picking up on subtle facial expressions,
Usually, yeah.
navigating a conversation that might go in all sorts of directions.
Exactly. And now add in the fact that Jehovah's Witnesses have like these set meeting times, often several times a week, and sometimes even dress codes. For someone who finds comfort in predictability, that can be great, but it can also be super restrictive if they struggle with inflexibility.
It's like a double-edged sword almost. The same thing that brings comfort can also create its own challenges.
100%. And we haven't even touched on sensory stuff. Just picture like a packed service, bright lights, loud music, lots of people moving around. If you've got sensory sensitivities, that could be completely overwhelming.
Yeah. Sometimes people don't realize how intense that sensory input can be. It's like, imagine trying to hear a whisper when someone's blasting music right next to you. That's kind of what it can feel like for someone experiencing sensory overload. And it's not even just the physical environment. The emotional intensity of religious services, that can be overwhelming too.
Oh, absolutely. And that's where anxiety, maybe even feeling isolated, that's where those things can become a real problem, especially if those sensory needs aren't acknowledged or accommodated.
Yeah, and what seemed like small things at first can really snowball. We've talked about social expectations and sensory overload, but there's another layer to this, right? I mean, how does all this impact an individual's sense of autonomy in such a structured environment?
That's a really important point. Jehovah's Witnesses, they put a ton of emphasis on obedience, following their interpretation of the Bible. But if you process information differently, if you question things or interpret them in your own way, well, that can create a lot of inner conflict, you know? It's not just about disagreeing with what the religion teaches. It's about how those beliefs play out in everyday life, you know?
Okay.
Like what jobs are okay to have, how you're supposed to date and get married, those sorts of things. And for someone on the spectrum, those expectations can feel even heavier, especially if what they want for themselves doesn't line up.
Right, like trying to walk a really narrow path where stepping off is a huge deal. No wonder it can be so tough.
Exactly. And if you don't deal with those internal struggles, that feeling of being different, well, if you don't have understanding and support, it can really mess with your mental well-being. We're talking about serious anxiety, maybe even depression, and feeling isolated, which is just really hard to shake.
It sounds like it could really make you feel like you don't belong anywhere. You're stuck between your faith and being neurodivergent, and the people you'd think would get it, they just don't.
Yeah, and that's where education is so crucial, both within the Jehovah's Witness community and for mental health professionals, too.
So if we know these challenges exist, What can people do, both individuals and the community as a whole, to make things more supportive and inclusive? Like, where do we even begin?
Honestly, it starts with just talking openly and honestly. If someone feels safe enough in their congregation, finding people who listen without judging them, that can be huge. Just creating a space where people who are struggling can share without being afraid of the consequences.
Which is where education comes in, right?
Yeah.
The more we raise awareness about autism, the less likely people are to see it as something scary or something to avoid.
Hmm.
Instead, they can start to see it as just a different way of experiencing the world.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, and in this case, it can be really freeing. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. For some people, finding a therapist who understands both autism and the ins and outs of religious communities, that can be incredibly helpful.
To have that safe place to process everything, to deal with those feelings of being torn between two worlds, it can make a world of difference. But it shouldn't be all on the individual to figure this out, right? Religious communities have a responsibility to be understanding and accepting of people who are different.
You're absolutely right. It's about realizing that diversity makes us stronger. Just like Jehovah's Witnesses value different opinions and experiences within their own faith, they should also embrace neurodiversity.
Yeah, it's about building each other up, not tearing each other down. Finding that middle ground where faith and neurodiversity not only coexist, but actually make each other stronger.
And sometimes building those bridges means we have to challenge old ways of doing things, question how we interpret things, and be open to changing practices so that they respect both someone's faith and their individual needs.
Like realizing that what might seem like a small change for one person, like having sensory-friendly spaces or changing how they communicate, can be a really big deal for someone else.
Exactly. And those changes, they don't weaken the faith. They actually make it stronger by making it accessible to more people. It's about recognizing that everyone has something special to offer, no matter how their brain works or how they connect to their spirituality.
It's about understanding that just because someone expresses their faith differently or sees the world in a way that's outside the norm, it doesn't make their faith any less real or their contributions any less valuable. It's about making sure everyone feels like they belong.
Right. Yeah, I like that. And it makes you think about the bigger picture, Like, how can all religious communities, not just Jehovah's Witnesses, be more welcoming and supportive of neurodiversity? That's a conversation we need to have.
For sure. Because at the end of the day, we all want that feeling of belonging, of being accepted for who we are, without having to fit into some perfect mold.
Exactly. And to make that happen, it might mean taking a hard look at traditions, being open to different ways of understanding religious texts, and yeah, even changing the way things are done to better support neurodivergent people.
It's about recognizing that a small change for one person could be life-changing for someone else. And those changes, they don't take away from faith. They make it stronger by making it accessible to everyone.
Right. And let's not forget how powerful personal stories can be. Sharing what it's like to navigate faith and neurodiversity, the good and the bad, that can create so much empathy and understanding within a community.
It's those personal connections, those moments of vulnerability that often lead to the biggest changes in perspective.
Absolutely. And for anyone listening who might be feeling stuck between their faith and their neurodiversity, just know you're not alone. There are people out there who get it, who are fighting for change and who are ready to listen.
Sometimes just knowing you're not alone can make all the difference in the world. It can be that little bit of hope that keeps you going, that helps you keep searching for your people, advocating for your needs, and believing that you can truly belong.
Well said. It's a journey of figuring out who you are, being resilient, and finding those communities, whether it's within organized religion or outside of it, where you can truly be yourself and thrive.
Wow, this deep dive has given us a lot to think about.
Yeah.
As we wrap up, I'm curious, what really stuck with you today? What new insights did you gain?
And maybe even more importantly, what little thing can you do in your own life to show understanding or acceptance?
Because sometimes those small acts of kindness can make the biggest difference. Thanks for joining us on this journey. And remember, building a more understanding and inclusive world is something we do together. Until next time, keep those great questions coming and keep diving deep.